Okay, well, welcome. Welcome to Maui Ocean Center's Sea Talk series. My name is Colleen Foster, and I am the Director of Education here and your host for this evening. Our special guest speaker this evening is Dr. Hans von Tilburg, but before we say a little bit about him, I'll let you know how the program grows tonight. So we have about a 45-minute talk, and then there's 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. So do please hold your questions until the end. Plus, he told us that he has some really great film that he'd like to share with us, so we might push the ending about 10 or 15 minutes so that we can share that with everybody. So we'll kind of play that by ear, so stand by. Dr. von Tilburg was originally introduced to the ocean by his father on their sloop, the Brunhilde, and started to dive at the age of 11. He was a geography major and science diver at the University of California in Berkeley and worked in the diving safety office while in East Carolina University's Maritime History and Nautical Archaeology program. Try saying that fast. He ran a graduate program in maritime archaeology and history while at the University of Hawaii studying Asian and Pacific maritime history. He is currently the coordinator for the Maritime Heritage Program in Pacific Island region and the unit diving supervisor for NOAA's National Ocean Service in Hawaii. And will be sharing some fascinating information with us this evening about World War II era wrecks from exercises that took place right here in Hawaii, many of them here around Maui. So please join me in providing a very warm welcome to Dr. Hans von Tilburg.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me here. Thank you, Colleen. It's my pleasure to be here. This is this subject is a passionate one for me. I'm fascinated by the history under the sea. I'm with the NOAA Sanctuary Program, and we've done a couple seasons of work over here on Maui. I'm going to talk about a World War II topic, and I'm not going to talk about Pearl Harbor. No disrespect, but what happened here on Maui was really important, and I don't know that that story is always getting out there. But I will talk about a number of history topics, shipwreck topics for Maui, and maritime archaeology. And if you don't know what that is, what the heck is maritime archaeology? Well, archaeology itself is just the study of the past through the artifacts that people dig up on the land. So the maritime stuff is usually underwater, and it's the same kind of thing. It's a social science. I'm a proud liberal arts major with a job. Thank you very much. I'll also make another confession to you tonight. I just found this out the other day. I am 1.5% Neanderthal. Thank you. Thank you, fellow Neanderthals. I'm very excited about that, and I'm excited to be here and to talk about this topic. So it's a social science, and there's data that's retrieved, historical and archaeological data. In this case, from historic period shipwrecks and underwater aircraft. It's not exactly this, though, running through jungles, being chased by rocks that are rolling or being shot at by poison-tipped arrows. That's all fine and good. I know sometimes people think he's an archaeologist. He's an actor. There's a lot more office work involved in what we do. I will say that. But it's not all boring. There are parts that are exciting when we get to do the field work. And I've got to admit to this, 45 years ago, this was about the most exciting thing I could think of. And if any of you remember this, Lloyd Bridges as Mike Nelson in the original Sea Hunt, but that's how I got into this business to begin with. But anyway, I digress. I do want to mention, before we talk about the Maui wrecks and World War II, the reason that my agency was involved in compiling the inventory of known shipwrecks and aircraft in the Hawaiian Islands. It's not just because we happen to like some of that stuff. There's actually another federal agency, BOEM, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, that has the responsibility for assessing applications for offshore projects. And if there are going to be any offshore projects, we want to know what the impacts will be to the natural resources and to the historic properties wherever they may be, cultural resources, if they're significant. So BOEM actually funded us, NOAA, Sanctuaries, to conduct a 3-year project to understand the submerged cultural resource, the shipwrecks and aircraft, to understand the cultural viewsheds between the islands, and to understand the Hawaiian maritime landscapes, and even do some case studies. And so that whole project is just coming to an end now. And what I'm telling you tonight is wrapped up in a report that BOEM will be approving, and once it's finally published by them, will be online and available to the public. So that's why we were doing this inventory in the Hawaiian Islands, and there was never really another inventory before this one. There's never been a total count, so we were interested. To give you a snapshot of what the GIS product looks like, there is all the known losses. The green triangles, and I know you can't make out the details, are the confirmed known wreck sites, planes and ships mostly. That means someone has had eyes on the wreck or the robot, the ROV, the remotely operated vehicle, has been there, and there's a position, an exact position. Yellow is, well, we haven't found it yet, but the historical documents are so precise that we know it's probably in that area, and if we looked around, we might find something. The orange is, if we did a lot of work and had some side scan sonar and magnetometer, might find it. And the reds, don't even look. It was out there in that direction somewhere, and I'll tell you, a lot of those red triangles are aircraft, and they're reported by the Navy as, lost at a magnetic bearing of 230, about 15 miles out. And that's a pretty small target. So, and in fact, about 1,000 red dots aren't even on that map because they're recorded as lost in the Hawaiian Islands in the water. So that's what it looks like. If you're interested in how many known sites we have, the green triangles, I can tell you there are 404 of those. Ships, aircraft, major parts of ships or aircraft. The total number of entries in the inventory right now is 2,120. Let's talk about Maui. That's what we're here to do tonight. So these are the confirmed known wreck sites for Maui, and I know that some of you out there are aware of others. If you're willing to share that information, I'm more than happy to record that, and if you want that information to go in the inventory, if you were the first person to ever find something, your name will be forever glorified in the annals of the electronic database. But right now, this is what we know. Of course, there are always going to be shipwrecks around major ports and harbor areas. And this is the Spartan up here in Spartan Reef. But I'm going to be talking about this group down here, all of these, because all of those sites are associated with World War II and the intensive training that went on here, 1942 to 1944, 1945. There's really no map of the marine areas, the ocean areas, well, no chart that we found yet that records where Navy ships were doing their training or where aircraft were practicing their target runs and bombing practice over marine areas. Haven't found it yet. There's something for the land areas. This is from the U.S. Army Museum, and you can see Maui here with these large areas set aside for military training during the World War II years. I think this map is kind of Oahu-centric, if I may say so, because, let's face it, my island's not that big. But it downplays the important role of Maui and this area right here in amphibious training. Amphibious tactics, that strategy, that was really developed in the 30s and came to fruition during the war, and is the reason we were successful in the Pacific, I believe, the naval aviation and the amphibious tactics. So let's talk about Maui and what went on. There are a couple places you can go to now where you can see this kind of history commemorated. There's a sign down at Kamahole Park talking about the practice ground for the Pacific. And there's actually a monument where the old UDT center used to be to the frogmen that trained there in Maui, because during this island hopping invasion, these campaigns in the Pacific, they had to go in early and take out the obstacles on the beach before the minesweepers came in and swept for mines. before the bombardment was fired by the gunnery took place from the large ships, before the landing craft went to the beaches. It's a whole phased operation. There are places you can go to see these kinds of pictures, and that sign happens to be one of them. This is right outside the Maui Ocean Center and down the beach a ways. This is Kihei in probably 1942. Barbed wire went up all over the islands, as you know. After the attack, martial law was declared, barbed wire went up, communications were censored, etc. Very dangerous time for the Hawaiian Islands. And then later on, when the training happened here, they wanted to simulate fortifications of what the Marines and Army and Navy personnel would be facing in the South Pacific, and they did some of that too. Here's another shot of Kihei, the beaches on Kihei with large LSTs, landing ship tanks, the major carrier for the amphibious materiel and other small craft. During the war, hauled up onto the beach, practicing rehearsals before the major campaigns, before the invasions in the South Pacific. Critical rehearsals. This became part of the U.S. military doctrine, is you can't expect to throw thousands of troops at these atolls without doing a full rehearsal before these very dangerous campaigns. This is a rare image of something that used to be further down the beach in the Kakaako area. This is the training pier for what's called the Maui Amphibious Training Center. It's no longer there. Today, there's the Surfside Resort, Five Palms, Days Inn, and of course, roads around here. Kilohana Road, I think, is right here. But the pier is gone. But I've never really snorkeled or dived around there. I bet there are probably remnants of it under the beach. And that's where a lot of the Navy personnel, Army personnel, learned some of the, embarkation techniques, climbing the rope ladders, etc., onto these landing craft. And I do want to make a quick aside and mention that our own Sanctuaries headquarters for the Humpback Whale Sanctuary on South Kihei Road was around in 1942. It's a little bit of fun history that I've in my spare time I've been looking into, because the rumor is, and I believe it was, at first, a Navy degaussing station, meaning the building built by the Navy had a generator and naval personnel that powered large loops of copper wire out in the ocean, a mile out in the ocean, big cable. And ships would drive through this degaussing range, and they would charge those cables, and it would reduce the magnetic signature of these steel ships. They'd be harder to detect by magnetic mines. These were incredible facilities. We haven't found any history of that degaussing station. Later on, it was an ionospheric research station, and then a NIST station, a broadcast station. Do you remember at the tone, the time will be ... on the clock? The Standards Institute used to do that from here, and now it's our headquarters. So it's a bit of our own history. But the reason I'm interested in it, or became interested in it, is right offshore from the headquarters, there's this large mooring. And here you can see this huge octagonal pontoon, steel pontoon, about 12 feet high, that used to float up at the surface, and it's anchored to this concrete block. And the concrete block has 3 big chains going to 3 very large Navy anchors. So big ships used to come in and moor there. I don't know if it had anything to do with the degaussing station. I just like to look at rusty stuff underwater. But let's get on to the shipwrecks and the aircraft wrecks. So, the reason, or the method, I should say, that we surveyed these World War II wrecks on Maui was part of a class that we've been holding in collaboration with the University of Hawaii Marine Option Program. And so for a number of summers, we'll take 2 or 3 weeks at a time, and we will get a group of interested undergraduate university science divers. And here we get to use our NOAA vessel, the Kohola, right at the harbor, right out there. And we'll focus on documenting historic shipwreck sites, in this case, in the Alaea area. This was our class in 2013. It's a wonderful course. It's taught on a budget, but it's a lot of fun. And here we are camping at a local residence, kind of between the garage containers. I gave part of this talk to a group that included an archaeology professor from Brown University, and he always disparaged graduate students. He said, you can make graduate students do anything, so that's why I put in cost-effective, self-propelled site survey units. The shameful fact is there's a lab fee, and we kind of run that course from the lab fee for a few $1,000s. That's okay. We have a good time. So the first site, or one of the sites we were looking at, was an aircraft. And it's right outside the harbor, really. It's a boat dive, a little further away from shore than you could comfortably swim. But there are a number of aircraft around the Hawaiian Islands. This one was recently discovered by, I think some fishermen knew about it first. And then the dive shop owner, Brad Varney at B&B Scuba, heard about it from the fishermen, and folks started to dive this plane. And we got involved, and local folks here identified the specific type of aircraft. The SB-2C-1C Helldiver, this is a World War II plane, and it's pretty intact on the bottom, and because we found the bureau number, the serial number itself, on the vertical stabilizer, which is broken off and in the sand, just why you don't see it, we could identify the exact incident that led to the demise of this aircraft. These Helldivers were dive bombers. It was their job to climb really high and then plummet towards their target, release the bomb, and pull out at high Gs. This is what the Dauntless, the SPD Dauntlesses used to do prior to this version. The Dauntlesses were well loved. The Helldivers were not. There were a number of derogatory terms that pilots had for these, unfortunately. Big-tailed beasts, or pardon my language, son of a bitch second class, SB-2C. These were not most maneuverable. They were heavy, and they splashed in quite frequently. This was perilous business, though. This training had its own hazards, and that's what happened. The pilot, Lieutenant Dill, and his radio operator were doing combat exercises in 1944, pulling out of high Gs, the whole vertical tail assembly bent over. They tried to make it back to Pu'unene Naval Air Station, which is close by. They didn't make it, and they ditched in the water. Lots of pilots had to ditch in Hawaii. The training was very hazardous. They climbed out, thankfully, and the plane rests pretty much just like it was when they ditched it in August 1944. And you can look into the radio compartment and see where the survival raft would have been pulled out of this canister right here, and they made it to shore. So that's a really nice historic property and carefully maintained. If it's no impact and people don't take anything from this wreck, makes a great recreational dive site. A bit of history. The students, as part of their training, did this sketch then. They do the plan view drawing. In this case, it's a relatively small wreck, so it's fairly simple for them. And this is a good way for them to document the status of the aircraft and all the features at that time. And we can kind of monitor the site over time. This is Navy property, though. So this still actually belongs to the federal government. Anybody dived it? Seen it out there? Yeah, it's a nice site. This is Pu'unene Naval Air Station, 1944, where they were trying to make it back to this landing runway now, which is the racetrack? Yeah, but the plane is out here. And in fact, when you look at the number of airfields in the Hawaiian Islands, there are maybe 15 or 20 Navy and Army airfields during the war years. And you look in line from the runways in the takeoff pattern, you generally find aircraft. Bad things happen on power up. And if they don't make it, those planes are going to ditch. Anyway, that's a nice historic photo from Bailey House Museum right here on Maui. Pu'unene Naval Air Station, if you don't know, became so busy during the war years, it became one of the major flight training areas, combat training stations in the United States, especially for night combat tactics. It was a very, very important naval air station. And it was capable of hosting a number of squadrons that came off carriers when those carriers came to the islands during those years. And now you can still go out there and see these revetments, which were berms that were built up to protect the aircraft from strafing runs. There's another aircraft close by, and then some of you may have seen this one as well, the Hellcat. This is in a couple parts. It's a smaller site, and it's in shallower water, but the students trained in identifying the radial engine. And you remember, we might get a couple students that are interested in archaeology and history, but the rest will be biologists wanting to check this field out, and that's fine. The first thing I'll ask them to do is, go tell me what that engine is, and they have to take the measurements and learn about what are the diagnostic features on that property that lead them to this connection, a Pratt & Whitney R2810 radial engine, to make the identity of the aircraft. That's the type of thing that underwater archaeologists do, become specialists in pieces of things. Hellcats were actually rather amazing aircraft, though, an excellent fighter aircraft for those years. 75% of all U.S. Navy air-to-air victories were by the F6F Hellcat. Quite successful, and there are a large number of these splashed in around Hawaii. This is the rest of the site, or a picture of a portion of the rest of it anyway. You can see it's inverted, upside down, and the fuselage and wings are here, but that's really all that's left. These are relatively fragile items, and we do have a high-energy environment, after all, especially in shallow water. So things fall apart over time. This is their measured sketch that the students learned to draw as part of the training. And the landing gear actually is quite diagnostic, so we featured that. They look at a number of other details too, like these wingtip navigation lights there and there, and use those to identify the aircraft. Why is the landing gear important? Carrier aircraft for the U.S. basically make controlled crash landings on carriers. You guys probably know that. They come in full power, they're looking to hook the wire. And if they don't hook the wire, they have to go around again. So the planes might be made of aluminum, but I can guarantee you the landing gear is not. It's made of solid steel, and often the only things we'll find on a really heavily impacted aircraft's wreck site is the engine, maybe the prop, and the landing gear. So become specialists in landing gear. You guys getting this down? This is all going to be on the test. Did I not tell you to take notes? I brought number 2 pencils. I'll talk about one more site that's local, off of Uluwatu actually, and it was discovered in the 80s by Ed Robinson, a local diver and dive operator, and he provided the picture here. I just want to share this to you because it is a site, unfortunately, that has been impacted by divers. This is a PB4Y1 Liberator. The 4.2s were called Privateers. The 2s were called Privateers later. But this was a long-range naval patrol aircraft with a crew with 5 or 6. And in 1944, this particular aircraft was lost due to engine problems. You can see the wreck site is deep. It's in, I think, over 200 feet of water. It's not exactly intact, but there's a lot of it there. And you can see the tail turret with the twin 50 caliber machine guns. That's what it looked like on the factory floor. And here's that tail turret section on the bottom in 1987. And unfortunately, in the later years, in 2006, looking down, top down, there's only one 50 cal left, and there's damage to this side. So that's not the kind of natural deterioration that happens over time. Those are divers that came and took that machine gun out of this historic property. And it's unfortunate, but it does happen. So there are a lot of aircraft in Hawaii, and I want to show you this graph because now that we have an inventory, we can actually put some numbers together. This shows you aircraft losses, all that we could compile from newspapers, Navy reports, etc., from 1922 to 1952. Why cut it off in 1952? Because at that point, the aviation branch of Naval History and Heritage Command said, unless you have a real reason to go into the records, now families are becoming involved, and so it's simpler to cut off this kind of historic research at that time. But you can see, in the 20s, when we begin to have aviation in the islands, flying boats, bi-wing flying boats, right? There'll be 1 or 2 losses every year, and it's a hazardous thing to do. You can pick out the war years, this graph. This is 1940, 1941, 42, 43, 44, and 45. That's 1945 right there, when there was 540 some aircraft losses in the Hawaiian waters in 1945. That averages out to 1 or 2 splashing in every day for the entire year. That is a tremendous statistic. That is the commitment in material and production, and sometimes in lives, that we made just for the training in Hawaii in order to then, for those lieutenants and engineers to go on to the South Pacific, and that's quite striking. If you can see the pie chart down here, you'll see the light blue, 272, those are the Helldivers, those dive bombers, the one that you have right out here in the bay. You'll see the gray here, that's the Hellcat, the one that you have right down there. How many Hellcats? 284 that we know about, F6Fs. Another large slice of pie is the red, those are F4U Corsairs. Lots and lots of planes splashed in. We know of about 40 or so have been confirmed, 40 or 50. Those are shallow water and also very deep water aircraft that are virtually intact, and we see those through manned submersibles with the Hawaii Undersea Research Lab. There's a historic artifact over there from those guys. And from ROVs and other things, we find planes like that. Let's talk about the craft, the landing craft, and the amphibious training, because that is really striking for this area, I believe. Here's a picture of the bay, and this is pretty much what it looks like when you look right out at the ocean from the Maui Ocean Center here. But this is 1944. And you have amphibious vessels, landing craft, and then AMTRACKS, assault vehicles, heading towards the beaches, because these were training beaches. This was one of the major rehearsals. In 1944, in this rehearsal, they happened to be getting ready for the invasion of Saipan and Tinian, and that was Operation Forager. So this was training for Operation Forager in August, I believe. And you can see the waves of craft approaching the beaches. These were large-scale exercises. This was not a matter of a handful of AMTRACKS or landing craft landing on the beaches. Ships would sortie from Pearl Harbor and from the Big Island. There would be gunnery practice, there would be aerial practice, naval aviation. Then there would be the landing exercises, and then the troops would stay on the island and conduct simulated combat on other islands, but a lot of it here on Maui as well. The nice thing about this area is you had the beaches, which were relatively protected, so it gave you kind of a guaranteed training area for sea conditions most of the time. So you can see that their route for these training had, this route rose here, and a task group was going to branch off and go down here towards McKenna. Finding the records of these kinds of things in the National Archives is amazing, because this is pre-computer planning. So every time the orders for training changes, they have to make 100 copies and destroy 100 copies. The paper trail is immense. For the landing craft themselves, they often arrived in these types of vessels, these LSTs, landing ship tanks, which were some, I think, 320 feet long. I might have that number incorrect. But these transported the smaller craft to ocean areas miles away from the invasion beach, the assault beach, opened up the bow doors, lowered the ramp, and the LVTs, the tracked vehicles, would splash into the water. Here you can see a number of LCIs, landing craft infantry, lined up. They're waiting. First you have the swimmers go in to clear the obstacles and the mine sweeping, then the gunnery practice to bombard the shore. Then the LVTs go in waves and attack the beach, and then the landing craft with the troops load and head for the beach. It's a really phased, complex operation that was innovated during these years, and it was quite critical to war efforts. This is what it looks like on an LST itself, landing ship tank. I guess large slow target was another name they had for LSTs. I know that maybe a lot of people think it wasn't the most glorious service. It wasn't like a destroyer or a battleship or a cruiser, but this was the meat of the game, the logistical effort, and the amphibious ships like these rather unglorious LSTs were what carried us across the Pacific. And you can see the AMTRACKS, the LVTs down here in the hold and up on deck, waiting to reach their deployment area. This is Maui in 1944, and these are AMTRACKS or LVTs. They've been called a number of different things. Tracked, an amphibious tractor is Amtrak. Landing vehicle tracked is LVT. They had a bunch of other names too, water buffaloes, alligators. There were versions that came out and they were improved very quickly, right before and then during the war years. So it made a big difference. For instance, if you had to climb over the side of it to get out on the beach, or if you had a ramp that actually lowered. But the important thing about these tracked vehicles, and here are the tracks, and they had little cups on the tracks, and that's what's pushing them through the water, is that unlike landing craft, when these hit the beach, they keep going. One of the most dangerous things that anyone's navies ever had to do was land troops on hostile beaches. One of the most dangerous parts about that is that landing craft dropping the ramp on that beach and then running out and facing those fortified positions. That's why they had AMTRACKS to go up onto the beach. Some of them carried troops. Some of them had fire support that they could put on the beach themselves, like this one. To show you how many of these got deployed, there were hundreds of these involved in the amphibious landings. This is a picture from Iwo Jima, 0 hour, 1945, and you can see the organized waves of craft going in through lanes that have been swept to the beaches that have been prepared. There are, I think, over 700 AMTRACKS involved in the invasion of Saipan in 1944. Mass-produced in bulk quantity and practiced right here on your beaches. I don't know if you'll be able to make this out, but this is a little further down the coastline. This is Wailea area down here. So we're up here, up near Alaea Harbor, Buzz's Wharf. But down the coast a ways, here is one of the training plans, beach red, fortification area, Wailea area. Fortification area, the note says, is being built into the replica of Tarawa's defenses. It is to be completed in about a month. Do not push across this area as it is still being built. Tarawa's not ready for you yet. So think about that next time you go down to Wailea. At one point, it was known as Tarawa for the trainees. But this map I particularly like, because this shows you, here we are up at the harbor, the deployment areas, 2nd Division, 4th Division, Maui Marines. And in these little boxes it says LST deployment area. So the LSTs branch off, deploy their AMTRACKS here, and then the assault vehicles go in through these lanes, these identified lanes, to the beach. And the wrecks that we're looking at are inside these lanes. So training accidents happened when they were landing. It's really fun to find maps like this, especially when they say secret. But they're just declassified, so don't worry. You can all go home tonight. I love finding stuff like that. So this is me diving into the archives. I'm going to kind of nerd out on you now. If I have a travel budget and make it back to Washington, D.C. or College Park, Maryland, and I have the time, I'm going to make a beeline to the National Archives because I love nothing more than going into these boxes of documents. You can see them here on the cart because you'll never know what you'll find. And when I came across the reference to Maui Amphibious Training Center, 4 boxes, and I had to get there right away. 7 a.m. when the doors open, I'm there. 5 p.m. when the doors close, they're kicking me out. And I don't know where the time goes, it's incredibly nerdy. I love it. But it's lots of fun. So some of these targets look like this. This is the troop carrier. This is an LVT-4. This is something that was proven in battle in 1944 for the invasion of Saipan. And this is, some of you have been to this one right off the beach. There are the tracks. It's kind of falling apart. Here's the the whole front end, which is kind of collapsed down where the engine was. And here are the masked student divers beginning to document the features on this, the overall dimensions to begin with. And this is the front end. It's quite fun to ask biologists to say, tell me what that is. I've got no idea how we could ever figure that out. Actually, there are a number of diagnostic features. The engine's in here, the cab was in here, and now it's quite a nice home for fish. But back in the day, this is what it looked like on the beaches, and you might recognize this beach. Is this Little Beach down near McKenna? Big Beach? Okay. There's an LVT-4, and it's got a ramp that flips down, and they can offload onto the beach without doing what they had to do on LVT-2, going up and over these sides. You go up over the sides like that, you're just a big target. So these were quite an innovation. And here are some other kind of detailed pictures of the site. It's in about 50 feet of water, I believe. One thing about these wreck sites is that they're always home for fish. I've always told students the fish love their history. They really do. But I think what the fish actually like more than that, apologies to the fish, is not being eaten by bigger fish. So these are always habitat, wonderful habitat. And often there'll be a group of fish around these wrecks that we kind of have to wait until they get out of the way, or some sea turtles, some honu will be there. Moray eels love wrecks. I can testify to that because I have a nasty habit of being bitten by moray eels. We do a lot of drawing underwater, so I don't like to wear gloves a lot. And shipwrecks have all kinds of scuppers and pipes and wonderful places for morays. But it's okay, I kind of gently ask them to leave and they go away. And then I get stitched up. This is the kind of map, kind of interpretive tool that the students end up making for that site, the tracks and overhead view of that LVT-4 troop carrier, and the compass rose and the scale, a nice diver in there for scale, and then the wreckage, and some of the diagnostic features that they were looking at underwater. These were a little more impressive, though, and sometimes these get confused for tanks. This is an armored Amtrak, an armored LVT. It has a turret. It's not a troop carrier. This would go right up onto the beach and provide support for the other vehicles and the other troops headed their way. In this case, this is a 75 millimeter howitzer. Earlier versions, LVT-4A1s had a 37 millimeter gun, depending on what you needed to do, but hundreds and hundreds of these were produced, and many of them trained here in Hawaii before going to the South Pacific. This happens to be a site that's pretty spread apart, fairly damaged it looks like, but there you can see the turret, the open turret, and the 75 millimeter, the tracks, the engines back here, and then here's the baseline the students put down as a reference mark to begin to measure things off that baseline and measure the whole site. Here you can look into the turret itself. Open turret, very encrusted, being recycled by the ocean over time, right? That's okay. There's their map of the site that they've made and the diagnostic features. And these become like interpretive tools when we talk about this site for many groups. There's the engine. It kind of looks chaotic at first, but in the end you can begin to recognize your landmarks on this radial engine and realize it's a Continental W679A, a radial engine. So these things were whining away. You can probably imagine the noise they made when they were charging towards the beach. A second LVTA-4 site is also in the same area. This one's a little more intact, but not much. That's the radio. You have to look at it for a while to understand you're looking at the radio parts and the tubes. There's a radiator. There's the self-sealing tanks. This is a good example of why I would say, well, it pays to have divers in the water with pencils and slates actually recording details, because you could photograph this all day and not see the radio. But when you have a diver in the water, we still beat other tools in terms of interpreting these types of resources on the bottom. And there's their sketch of that site. This is an LVT that we actually have a picture of by a friend of mine here in Maui, Bob Brook. but we haven't been able to relocate this yet. So there are others out there that don't have positions or haven't been confirmed. And like I say, if you're interested in sharing information, I'm more than happy to talk with you. And this one looks actually fairly intact. That's pretty impressive. So these were testimonies to all of this intensive training going on, and lots of these, of course, hit the beaches, then went back on board the ships, back to Pearl Harbor, and on to the South Pacific. But the training didn't stop at the beaches. You know, folks went inland, and here's a communications group moving inland into simulated areas of what they were going to face in the South Pacific. There are lots of pillboxes around our islands, your island as well, Maui. And you can still find some of these. Sometimes they're more apparent than others. Sometimes they're just a concrete square in the surf zone. There are actually still machine gun pillboxes left all around our islands, and lots of training happened there. And a lot of this training was conducted by the Maui Marines, the 4th Marine Division, because that's the division that lived here for 2 years. And right up on the slopes of Haleakala was Camp Maui, which these young soldiers, these young Marines made. And there were, you know, thousands and thousands of Marines living there. And actually, from what I've read over time, they developed quite a close relationship with the communities here. And folks at Maui are very proud of the 4th Division. They called them the Maui Marines. And you can still go to where that training camp used to be. Now it's a nice memorial park. Here's a picture of entertainment back then, though, the fights at the camp to entertain the troops. And they would come back to Maui after going to the South Pacific, and hopefully they came back. Some didn't. And ultimately, of course, at the end of the war, the Marines depart. Here's a picture of the 4th Marine Division leaving Kahului Harbor, boarding the ships for San Francisco. The 2nd Marine Division and the 5th Marine Division were on the Big Island, and but the Maui Marines were quite well known here. And so when we have Pearl Harbor ceremonies, as we just did, Pearl Harbor is a large and well-known story, and it should be remembered, but I feel it's nice to remember some of the things that may get overshadowed when those Pearl Harbor stories get told, like what went on here on Maui. And that's not the only thing I tend to talk about sometimes. I do ramble on a bit. But it wasn't just the soldiers and the Marines that paid a price during the war. Everyone pays a price. The home front paid a price, and we shouldn't forget about that. My mother was here for the attack. She was in Pearl City. And my uncles were sent up into the hills with 3 days of ammunition and rations because the islands were going to be invaded. That's what we thought. And there was immediate curfew and blackout. Martial law was declared. Suspension of habeas corpus, which is the legal term, which means you can be detained for whatever reason. You don't really have the same rights as we do as a civilian society. Alcohol rationing. Talk about tough times. There are some really good stories told about the salvage efforts that went on in Pearl Harbor and what happened when the divers who were going into ships like the Arizona found the spirit locker and what they did with those bottles. They went into bags hanging from the dive barge, and they hauled them up later. Curfew, gas masks carried, travel restrictions. You've probably heard of these things before. It was all a very, very difficult time. My aunties used to tell stories about it, though. They remembered the good times. They said, oh, yeah, it was great. We had blackout parties. What do you mean blackout parties, Auntie? That means when there's curfew and there's blackout, you can't drive home, so you just stay and have a party. It's not the same as we talk about blackout parties. They remember the good times, but it wasn't all good times. I just want to point out that the territory of Hawaii back then underwent the longest period of martial law of any American territory ever. And it wasn't easy. And there are a number of scholars and other people who feel that after it became apparent that the Japanese were not going to invade, that it should have been lifted earlier than October 1944. Who knows? Who knows? But there is a price to pay in terms of the military and civilians during the war. So to put those vessel losses in context, though, because we've talked about those specific World War II wrecks right down the coast, they are right here. AMTRACKS, 29 throughout all of the Hawaiian Islands. There's their slice of pie. The purple are landing craft, 19 landing craft. There's the purple slice of pie. So you can see, compared to all of the vessel wrecks in the Hawaiian Islands that we know of, they're a relatively small number, right? Although you can pick out the war years on this graph, right here. Lots of those losses. What's happening here? This is the plantation period. These 1860s and 70s is steamship, more traffic inter-island, more plantation work, so more vessels being lost. But there's the spike for World War II. What's the blue wedge of pie? That's impressive, 139 schooners. 139 schooners, 19th century stuff. That's an issue for a different talk. To show you where some of those unlocated sites are, this is generally how it looks around the island of Maui. And you can see it's all kinds of things. There's other aircraft that we haven't found yet, Hellcats, Wildcats, more Helldivers, more LVTs. Not really sure where those are, but we know their approximate locations. But you can see there's a whole range of stuff. Schooners, barks, brigs, fishing boats, sampans, of course. Even the young hero, the whaler from the 19th century. The yellow are, we kind of have a good idea, and the oranges, we have less of a good idea of where it might be. So there's still things to be discovered if there's any trace of those left, if they haven't been salvaged entirely. I mentioned the Spartan earlier. Max Young provided these pictures of that shallow water wreck site. Spartan was a three-masted commercial sailing vessel, and it went on to the reef, Spartan Reef here. That's no coincidence. That's how the reef got its name. And folks have found that site, although I haven't dived it yet, but I would love to see it. It's a difficult site to work. It's shallow. It's in the surf zone. And those are tough conditions for us. This talk tonight focused on Maui and on the Naval Legacy, not those other, non-naval vessels. This will give you an idea of the number of Navy ships lost in the Hawaiian Islands, and the yellows are the ones we've found. And the whites are still out there. Plus 30 smaller LVTs, landing craft. Navy and Army aircraft, this slide's a little out of date, that's why it says 30 aircraft, 12 barges, etc. Japanese submarines, those are all topics for a different talk. Now, I should mention to you that some of these resources are protected by law. We're a resource management agency, so it's my responsibility, but I'm not going to berate you, but it will be on the test. There are state and federal laws that protect historic properties. Is everything a historic property? No, it's not. There are actually some standards and criteria that we apply to define what is and what isn't. But for things that are determined to be historic properties, there are a number of laws in place. And for the stuff that we've been talking about tonight, the Sunken Military Craft Act is probably the main law. Sometimes it's not understood very well, but military aircraft and ships, wherever they may be in the world, remain the property of the federal government unless there's a specific act of Congress to strike them from the list. Okay? So that means the aircraft and other ships out there are federal property, and damaging or taking pieces off of that is something that is the concern for Naval History and Heritage Command, the managers for those properties, and that command is in Washington, D.C., just to let you know. So it's not all junk, and it's not all up for grabs. I like it because it's history beneath the sea. So is this stuff too. These are deeper ocean targets. This happens to be the Japanese mini-sub that sunk outside Pearl Harbor, the one that was sunk by the USS Ward about an hour before the planes arrived. And also a PBY flew over and dropped some depth charges. There's the 4-inch shell hole that the Ward's shot made in the sail that sank this two-man submarine that, along with 4 of its fellow submarines, was in the process of trying to sneak into Pearl Harbor moments before the attack. It's a wonderful story. We've done a lot of science on this site. Topic for another talk sometime. We happen to have a lot of submarines out in Hawaiian waters, actually. 29 of them. This is the bow of the S-19, an American wartime submarine, older wartime submarine. You can see the torpedo tubes, the doors right there for the tubes. And this is our ROV, Deep Discoverer, which is part of our Oceanus Explorer ocean system for surveying sites like this. Topic for another talk. We've looked at places elsewhere in the Pacific when we've had the opportunity to do so. When the NOAA Oceanus Explorer has gone there, we were surveying an area near Wake Atoll for a Japanese destroyer, the Hayate, which was sunk at the beginning of the battle for Wake Island at the outbreak of World War II. We didn't find the destroyer. We found the Amakasu Maru No. 1, which was sunk a year later by one of our submarines. Topic for a different talk. So, is that stuff junk? Is it history? I think in these cases, it's a wreck that has enough integrity and history that it has a story to tell. It has information in terms of history and archaeology. So it's historic property. Everything's falling apart underwater. Eventually, this will fall apart completely, lose that context of history and archaeology, have no story to tell, then it's rust. I'm okay with that. This is a picture of the 2013 team that did most of the work on these targets out here. The University of Hawaii science divers. And I also want to say that there was a team in 2011 that looked at some of the same sites, and I'm sorry I didn't put a picture in to commemorate them as well, but these are young UH students that we're using, frankly, for our inventory purposes, and they've captured some of this history for you guys tonight. And so my hat's off to motivated young science divers like these, and a particularly nice-looking young woman here, Sabina, who is the cook, and I only mention her because she's my daughter. So that's my talk. Thank you very much. I have some footage I want to show you if we have time for that, because I was looking around and kind of requesting that, let me get this arrow back here, the Smithsonian help us with looking for some historic footage of the training, and I didn't know if they would have any or not. But lo and behold, after a while, we happened to find some historic footage of Alaea Bay. let's pause the video, and I'm going to be around. If any of you have other questions, I'd be happy to talk with you. I tell you, giving talks like this is thirsty work, so I look forward to being done. But it's been my pleasure to come here tonight and to be with you folks. And thanks to the Ocean Center for having me over and giving me a chance to share my interest in this type of history with you. Thank you.